Hi guys, we are finished talking about homeostasis, except in physiology you're never really finished talking about homeostasis. And I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about cell metabolism. This subject is sometimes a little dry and a little hard for people, so I'm just going to, before you get started, ask you to hang in there and realize that this is a bit more chemistry intensive than the rest of the semester is going to be, and really realize that my objective, which with teaching you cell metabolism, is always going to be to apply it to human physiology. So I'm really building the framework so that I can talk about, for instance, hormones in the future and how they impact metabolism. So if it's not your very favorite, you won't be alone. It's not even my favorite to teach. Okay, so the metabolism stuff that I'm going to do is spread around in Chapter 3 and a little bit of it in Chapter 20 and 21. Just FYI, whenever you run into the chapters here, I'm never holding you responsible for the entirety of a chapter unless I cover all of the chapters. So how do you know what you should study from a chapter? Well, if there's a figure reference from a chapter, go look at that figure. If you don't understand how I talk about it in your textbook or in your notes, go read it in your textbook. And then also remember, since we're in the second set of notes now, this before you begin section, this is stuff that I'm going to assume that you know generally from other classes, and I'm not going to lecture on it specifically, and I'm not going to test on it specifically, except that it is fundamental for you understanding what I'm about to talk about. So you may need to go back and look at it if, for instance, you do not remember the terminology of fats, lipids, fatty acids, reactants, products, substrates. But I am going to generally start with Roman numeral 2. And so I want to start talking about metabolism, but I want to kind of change the perspective on metabolism from how it's generally talked about. So this is how I burn 2,300 calories in a day from a little Vox article. And this is how people generally talk about metabolism, and it is related to what we're talking about. But when I'm talking about metabolism and physiology, before we get to the big picture metabolism of what your whole body burns over the course of a day and why, for instance, my husband has a higher metabolism than me, which we will be talking about throughout this semester, I want to talk about what you mean by the term metabolism at a cellular level. So first, let's do a working definition of metabolism. There's any number of definitions of metabolism, but so we're all in the same place. Basically, what I'm talking about when I say metabolism is all of the biochemical reactions that occur in a cell, including both the synthesis of molecules, organic molecules, like making a protein, and the breakdown of organic molecules, like breaking down glucose to form ATP. So that's a big picture understanding of metabolism. But then we can subdivide metabolism into anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism, I don't know if you've ever heard the term anabolic steroids. Anabolism, that's how I kind of remember it, because anabolic steroids want to make you build muscle. Anabolism is producing larger molecules from smaller reactants, like, for instance, taking the amino acids from your diet and making them into skeletal muscle, right? So specifically making them into the large proteins in skeletal muscle. Now, anabolic reactions typically require energy. So when I think anabolism, I think construct things and consume energy. Costs energy to build things. So you are going to need to know the term anabolism and catabolism. I'm going to use them throughout this set of notes and throughout the rest of the semester. Catabolism. This is taking larger, usually organic molecules like a fat or a protein or a lipid or a carbohydrate, and breaking them down into smaller products. So if we start with, for instance, glucose, and you guys probably know the simple equation for glucose is just C6H12O6. And through a series of chemical reactions, we break it down to smaller molecules, H2O and CO2, and we also release ATP as a byproduct. So breaking larger molecules down into smaller products and generally releasing energy as a byproduct, that is catabolism. So whereas anabolism, again, is constructing things and consuming energy, catabolism is generally destroying or breaking down things and releasing energy. And in the body, by the way, you are going to use catabolic processes to give you the energy to run anabolic processes. So to put it together with the cell biology, how would you get the energy to, for instance, build a protein, which is an anabolic process? Well, you'd break down maybe glucose and generate the ATP that was necessary to run this anabolic process. So we've got anabolism and catabolism, and you require both of those. Okay, so let's just start talking about the concept of a metabolic pathway, because we're going to run into metabolic pathways. And metabolic pathways, it's a general term as well, but I just want you to know what I'm talking about. So if you're looking at a metabolic pathway, it's basically a series of steps. Most of the steps are going to be enzyme catalyzed, so that little arrow there would be catalyzed by an enzyme. Let's call it enzyme 1. This one would be catalyzed by enzyme 2, enzyme 3, and I realize these are not chemical symbols. I'm just showing you that A plus B catalyzed by enzyme 1 gets you C, product, which is the reactant, to go to D, which is catalyzed by enzyme 2, and D plus E catalyzed by enzyme 3 gets you the product of F. Okay, so generally speaking, in the human body, if you have a complex product, it's not going to occur in a single chemical reaction. There's usually a pathway, a metabolic pathway. I'll show you one, but don't get freaked out, because I'm not going to make you memorize this one in this class. You have to memorize it in biochemistry, but not in physiology. Here is a real metabolic pathway, which I don't show first because it makes people cry. All of these are chemical reactions catalyzed by enzymes. You're seeing the enzymes numbered here. Okay, it's a series of 10 chemical reactions, each of which is catalyzed by an enzyme to get you this final product, which is pyruvate. This is actually the biochemical pathway known as glycolysis in detail. And like I said, in this class, you do not have to be able to draw all of these out or do this in this way. If you take biochemistry, when I took biochemistry, I certainly did. But this is just an example of biochemical pathway, not the detail that I need you to know it in. But we are going to be talking about multiple biochemical pathways. And I'll simplify them for you, because what I really want you to do is get the fizz out of this. Okay, so before we get any further into biochemical pathways and talk about cellular respiration, which is what we're going to do next, I want to talk about the concept of macronutrients and micronutrients. Okay, so we will spend a decent amount of time talking about macronutrients in this set of notes. So what is a macronutrient generally? It's a nutrient, something that you're going to ingest that you need in relatively large quantities, generally speaking, because you're going to use it to make your own organic molecules. So the classics of macronutrients are going to be carbohydrates, which are kind of represented here, fats or lipids, and proteins. Those are the three biggies as far as macronutrients. We're going to talk about each of them in a little bit of detail as we go through here. Now, just to put this together with something that you've learned in anatomy, a little away from chemistry for a second and back to anatomy. You are going to use these primarily for catabolic processes to produce energy, although not exclusively. We know that you use proteins for anabolic processes as well. But let's put this back together with anatomy for just a second and say, okay, so where do you absorb your macronutrients? Primarily, you absorb your macronutrients in the small intestine, and you are going to absorb them. I don't know if you guys remember that you've got villi in the small intestine, and then the cells that line the small intestine are usually some kind of simple columnar epithelium, with microvilli to increase transport. So as far as cell biology, and then we'll get to this in a little bit more detail, how do you generally absorb macronutrients in your gut? Well, in the next set of notes, I will teach you mechanisms for predicting how something would be transported, and then we'll be able to get more specific about how glucose is transported versus fatty acids versus water versus a bunch of stuff. But generally speaking, when you're talking about transport in the gut, how you get them from the lumen of your gut into your body, you're going to use the cheapest, fastest mechanism that you can. If diffusion is possible, you'll do that one. If not, facilitated diffusion might work. Active transport, primary or secondary. Osmosis is generally for water. And in the next set of notes, I'll teach you how to predict how something is going to be absorbed. It's not as hard as you think it is. Okay, so now let's talk about where they go. Where do you absorb carbs, proteins, and lipids? Where do they go once they get in your body? So this is important. Okay, so if I am absorbing at the intestine, the small intestine generally, you are going to absorb carbohydrates and proteins, which are generally water soluble. Those are going to go straight into your bloodstream. Okay, so they're going to go into this blood capillary that you're seeing right there, and they're going to go into your bloodstream. Okay, but lipids are different. Lipids actually do not get absorbed directly into the bloodstream, and you may or may not have learned this in anatomy. Sometimes we run out of time for the lymphatic system. They actually get absorbed into this little green guy right here. This is called a lacteal, and instead of a blood capillary, it's a lymphatic capillary. And so fats actually go into the lymphatic system, and then they move up the lymphatic system, not in the blood yet, and then they actually get dumped into the subclavian veins. And then they go around circulation, and eventually they'll make it into the bloodstream, but not immediately. And that matters for a couple of reasons. The transport mechanism is not as fast. In addition, they also bypass hepatic portal circulation the first time around, so they get into the bloodstream as a whole without going into hepatic portal circulation. Some of you guys may remember that hepatic portal circulation is important for sort of surveillance of absorbed nutrients, because there might be toxins or pathogens in there. Lipid-soluble stuff forgoes that surveillance the first time around. Okay, now what happens to these macronutrients after they get absorbed? They can have a few different fates. After you get a macronutrient into the bloodstream, you can, as I mentioned, use it for catabolic processes. You can break it down to get ATP, right? And you guys, of course, know that you can use carbohydrates to get ATP, or fat to get ATP, or even proteins to get ATP. But you can also use those macronutrients after you've absorbed them for anabolic processes. You can use amino acids that you absorb to make big proteins, to make more muscle. You can use the glucose that you absorbed to store as glycogen, a big sugary molecule. You can do you can do a couple of different things with them, catabolic or anabolic processes. And then what if you have excesses? What if after I absorbed them and I used the ATP that I needed for catabolic processes, I used them for ATP for catabolic processes, and then I used them for anabolic processes, and then I still had extra? Well, then you can store them quite often as fat. And that, of course, impacts the way that other people talk about metabolism, people who are not in physiology. One of the important things that I want to show you here, and I'll show it to you several times, but this is sort of a summary of how cellular respiration works with the three different kinds of macromolecules. But the important thing that I want you to see is that I can take glucose, of course, I can take glucose, of course, and break it all the way down to ATP. I'll talk about that in a minute. I can take fatty acids, and it's a different pathway, but it can go to ATP too, also glycerol. I can take amino acids from proteins, and I can break those down to ATP, but I also want you to look and notice that you can take too much glucose, and if you did whatever you needed to do from it, you can actually take that and make it into a fatty acid, store fat. You can take too much protein and make that into a fatty acid, right? You can, of course, take fat, store the excess, make it into a fatty acid as well. So the excess nutrients can also be converted to one another. Sugars can be stored as fats, proteins can be stored as fats, all kinds of things can be made into fat. So, and then the other sort of less common fate of a macronutrient is that macronutrients also can not just be catabolic or anabolic or storage. They can also be used for like making membrane phospholipids, precursors to hormones. Those are some small things that they can be used for. Okay, so last tidbit before we just talk about the organs that are going to be involved in this story we're going to tell. What about micronutrients? What are micronutrients? Those are essential nutrients, but they're only needed in trace amounts, hence micronutrients. And those include vitamins and minerals. Vitamins and minerals are not needed in large enough quantities to use them for instance, catabolic processes, but they are absolutely necessary. Vitamins tend to be organic, they're carbon-based. And you could get them by eating any plant, any animal, if it had the vitamins in it. So they're carbon-based. And there are water-soluble vitamins and there are lipid-soluble vitamins. The lipid-soluble vitamins are ADEK, A-D-E and K. And one of the things with lipid-soluble vitamins is if you take them in excess, they'll get stored in your lipids. Water-soluble vitamins, unless you're taking outrageously high amounts, they'll generally get cleared through your kidneys, but lipid-soluble vitamins won't. So it's more possible to overdose on a lipid-soluble vitamin. It's possible in both, but lipid-soluble vitamins can be toxic in higher doses more quickly, and they're less cleared out by your kidneys. So that's the answer to there, the lipid-soluble ones. And what's the difference between a vitamin and a mineral? Still needed in trace amounts, still not really used directly for catabolic processes, but minerals are inorganic. A lot of them are metals. You could get minerals that you need by licking a rock instead of eating broccoli, as long as it was the right rock, right? Okay, so that's vitamins and minerals, and we can touch on those as we go a little more through this semester. And then the last tidbit, just to put it together with anatomy, as we go through this, and you've got this figure in your notes, the major organs that are involved in regulating metabolism are the small intestine. Most absorption actually happens at the duodenum. That's the primary site of absorption, not exclusively, but mostly. The brain is really important in metabolism because it's really needy, but it doesn't store anything. It doesn't prepare for the future. It has really high metabolic needs. It's really picky. It depends almost exclusively on glucose for its metabolic needs, but it doesn't store any appreciable amount of nutrients. So it really depends on the rest of the body to make sure that it is always supplied with its very, very needy metabolic needs. The pancreas is a big player here. The pancreas is involved in really telling you when to store nutrients, like when you have enough, you can store them, and when to release stored nutrients. And again, it's going to be really important in making sure that the brain and all other organs get what they need, even in times when you're, for instance, fasting. And it's doing this primarily by knowing when to release the two hormones that we talked about in the first set of notes, which are insulin and glucagon. And you'll learn those all semester long. So before you leave this semester, you should have a really solid understanding of insulin and glucagon. Okay, the liver is the next big player because the liver is the primary bank where you put your excess nutrients. It's not the exclusive bank, but it's the primary bank. Whenever I have excess glucose, I put it in the liver to save it for later. I can store other excesses in the liver as well. It's the primary site for storage of excess nutrients. And then adipose is the last one. If I still have more after I've stored all the sugar I can in the liver as glycogen, I'm going to store the excess nutrients that I still have in adipose tissue as what we call triglycerides, which you may or may not have heard that term before. Okay, so that's just your intro to metabolism. And the next video is going to be about a physiological approach to cellular respiration.